Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 495, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Part 7. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Here, the author looks at various conflicts that develop in our country. Conflicts dealing with minorities, labor, women, voters' rights, and other things. Today's show will feature background footage from Strawberry Gap Trail. Strawberry Gap Trail is in Girton, North Carolina. To get there from Asheville, North Carolina, take 74A East. Eventually, you cross into Henderson County as you go over Hickory Nut Gap. Shortly thereafter, take a right into the parking lot. The trail's at the edge of the parking lot. First, you come to Ferguson Peak, with a great view of Fairview. But then, if you continue on a ways, you eventually come to Blue Ridge Meadows, where you have a nice view of the foothills to the east. So now, let's continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Martin Sherwin says that among the Nagasaki dead were probably American prisoners of war. He notes a message of July 31st from headquarters, U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces, Guam, to the War Department. Reports of prisoner of war sources, not verified by photos, give location of Allied prisoner of war camp 1 mile north of the center of the city of Nagasaki. Does this influence the choice of this target for initial centerboard operation? Request immediate reply. Now, let's go to page 437 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. In 1960, the military budget was $45.8 billion, 49.7% of the budget. That year, John F. Kennedy was elected president, and he immediately moved to increase military spending. In 14 months, the Kennedy administration added $9 billion to defense funds, according to Edgar Bottom. By 1962, based on a series of invented scares about Soviet military buildup, a false bomber gap, and a false missile gap, the United States had overwhelming nuclear superiority. It had the equivalent in nuclear weapons of 1,500 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, far more than enough to destroy every major city in the world. The equivalent, in fact, of 10 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on Earth. To deliver these bombs, the United States had more than 50 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 80 missiles on nuclear submarines, 90 missiles on stations overseas, 1,700 bombers capable of reaching the Soviet Union, 300 fighter bombers on aircraft carriers able to carry atomic weapons, and 1,000 land-based supersonic fighters able to carry atomic bombs. The Soviet Union was obviously behind. It had between 50 and 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles and fewer than 200 long-range bombers. But the U.S. budget kept mounting. The hysteria kept growing. The profits of corporations getting defense contracts multiplied, and employment and wages moved ahead just enough to keep a substantial number of Americans dependent on war industries for their living. Now, let's go to page 456 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Congress began reacting to the Black Revolt, the turmoil, the world publicity. Civil rights laws were passed in 1957, 1960, and 1964. They promised much on voting equality, on employment equality, but were enforced poorly or ignored. In 1965, President Johnson sponsored and Congress passed an even stronger voting rights law, this time ensuring on the spot federal protection of the right to register and vote. The effect on Negro voting in the South was dramatic. In 1952, 1 million Southern blacks, 20% of those eligible, registered to vote. In 1964, the number was 2 million, 40%. By 1968, it was 3 million, 60%, the same percentage as white voters. Now, let's go to page 458. Hold on, let me find it. But it did not work. The blacks could not be easily brought into the Democratic coalition. When bombs kept exploding in churches, when new civil rights laws did not change the root condition of black people. In the spring of 1963, the rate of unemployment for whites was 4.8%. For non-whites, it was 12.1%. According to government estimates, 1/5 of the white population was below the poverty line, and 1/2 of the black population was below that line. The civil rights bills emphasized voting, but voting was not a fundamental solution to racism or poverty. In Harlem, blacks who have voted for years still lived in rat-infested slums. Now, let's go to page 474. One day in June 1963, a Buddhist monk sat down in the public square in Saigon and set himself afire. More Buddhist monks began committing suicide by fire to dramatize their opposition to the Diem regime. Diem's police raided the Buddhist pagodas and temples, wounded 30 monks, arrested 1,400 people, and closed down the pagodas. There were demonstrations in the cities. The police fired, killing 9 people. Then, in Hue, the ancient capital, 10,000 demonstrated in protest. Now, let's go to page 483 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. By early 1968, the cruelty of the war began touching the conscience of many Americans. For many others, the problem was that the United States was unable to win the war. While 40,000 American soldiers were dead by this time, 250,000 wounded, with no end in sight. The Vietnam casualties were many times this number. Lyndon Johnson had escalated a brutal war and failed to win it. His popularity was at an all time low. He could not appear publicly without a demonstration against him and the war. The chant, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Was heard in demonstrations throughout the country. In the spring of 1968, Johnson announced that he would not run again for president and that negotiations for peace would begin with the Vietnamese in Paris. Now, let's go to page 485. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee declared in early 1966 that the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy in violation of international law and called for a withdrawal from Vietnam. That summer, 6 members of SNCC were arrested for an invasion of an induction center in Atlanta. They were convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. Around that same time, Julian Bond, an SNCC activist who had just been elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, spoke out against the war and the draft, and the House voted that he not be seated because his statements violated the Selective Service Act and tend to bring discredit to the House. The Supreme Court restored Bond to his seat, saying that he had the right to free expression under the First Amendment. Now, let's go to page 486. A remarkable change in sentiment took place. In early 1965, when the bombing of North Vietnam began, 100 people gathered on the Boston Common to voice their indignation. On October 15th, 1969, the number of people assembled on the Boston Common to protest the war was 100,000. Perhaps 2 million people across the nation gathered that day in towns and villages that have never seen an anti-war meeting. In the summer of 1965, a few hundred people had gathered in Washington to march in protest against the war. The first in line, historian Stoughton Lynn, SNCC organizer Bob Moses, and longtime pacifist David Dellinger were splattered with red paint by hecklers. But by 1970, the Washington peace rallies were drawing hundreds of thousands of people. In 1971, 20,000 came to Washington to commit civil disobedience, trying to tie up Washington traffic to express their revulsion against the killings still going on in Vietnam. 14,000 of them were arrested, the largest mass arrest in American history. Now, let's go to page 517 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Well, in any one year, 1972 for instance, perhaps 375,000 people will be in jail, county or city, or in prisons, state or federal, and 54,000 in juvenile detention. There will also be 900,000 under probation and 300,000 on parole. A total of 1,600,000 people affected by the criminal justice system. Considering turnover, in any one year, several million people will come in and go out of this system. It is a population largely invisible to middle class America. But if 20 million blacks could be invisible for so long, why not 4 or 5 million criminals? A study by the Children's Defense Fund in the mid 70s revealed that more than 900,000 young people under 18 are jailed in the course of a year. Now, let's go to page 526 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The United States government had signed more than 400 treaties with Indians and violated every single one. For instance, back in George Washington's administration, a treaty was signed with the Iroquois of New York. The United States acknowledged all the land within the aforementioned boundaries to be the property of the Seneca Nation. But in the early 60s, under President Kennedy, the United States ignored the treaty and built a dam on this land, flooding most of the Seneca Reservation. Now, let's go to page 536. In the 60s and 70s, it was not just a women's movement, a prisoners' movement, an Indian movement. There was a general revolt against oppressive, artificial, previously unquestioned ways of living. It touched every aspect of personal life: childbirth, childhood, love, sex, marriage, dress, music, art, sports, language, food, housing, religion, literature, death, schools. Now, let's go to page 554 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The CIA inquiry disclosed that the CIA had gone beyond its original mission of gathering intelligence and was conducting secret operations of all kinds. For instance, back in the 1950s, it had administered the drug LSD to unsuspecting Americans to test its effects. One American scientist, given such a dose by a CIA agent, leaped from a New York hotel window to his death. Now, let's go to page 570 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It soon became clear that blacks in the United States, the group most in support of Carter for president, were bitterly disappointed with his policies. He opposed federal aid to poor people who needed abortions, and when it was pointed out to him that this was unfair because rich women could get abortions with ease, he replied, "Well, as you know, there are many things in life that are not fair, that wealthy people can afford and poor people cannot." Now, let's go to page 574. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall were the last of the court's liberals. Old and ill, though reluctant to give up the fight, they retired. The final act to create a conservative Supreme Court was President Bush's nomination to replace Marshall. He chose a black conservative, Clarence Thomas, despite dramatic testimony from a former colleague, a young black law professor named Anita Hill. that Thomas had sexually harassed her. Thomas was approved by the Senate, and now the Supreme Court moved even more decisively to the right. Now, let's go to page 639 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The society's levers of powers would have to be taken away from those whose drives have led to the present state. The giant corporations, the military, and their politician collaborators. We would need, by a coordinated effort of local groups all over the country, to reconstruct the economy for both efficiency and justice, producing in a cooperative way what people need most. We would start on our neighborhoods, our cities, our workplaces. Work of some kind would be needed by everyone, including people now kept out of the workforce, children, old people, handicapped people. Society could use the enormous energy now idle, the skills and talents now unused. Everyone could share the routine but necessary jobs for a few hours a day and leave most of the time free for enjoyment, creativity, labors of love, and yet produce enough for an equal and ample distribution of goods. Certain basic things would be abundant enough to be taken out of the money system and be available, free, to everyone. Food, housing, healthcare, education, transportation. Now, let's go to page 647. The Crime Bill of 1996, which both Republicans and Democrats in Congress voted for overwhelmingly, and which Clinton endorsed with enthusiasm, dealt with the problem of crime by emphasizing punishment, not prevention. It extended the death penalty to a whole range of criminal offenses and provided $8 billion for the building of new prisons. All of this was to persuade voters that politicians were tough on crime. But, as criminologist Todd Clear wrote in the New York Times about the new crime bill, harsher sentencing had added 1 million people to the prison population, giving the United States the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And yet violent crime continued to increase. Why? Clear asked. Do harsh penalties seem to have so little to do with crime? A crucial reason is that police and prisons have virtually no effect on the sources of criminal behavior. He pointed to those sources. About 70% of prisoners in New York State come from 8 neighborhoods in New York City. These neighborhoods suffer profound poverty, exclusion, marginalization, and despair. All these things nourish crime. Now, let's go to page 648. Both major political parties joined to pass legislation, which Clinton then signed, to remove welfare benefits, food stamps, payments to elderly and disabled people from not only illegal but legal immigrants. By early 1997, letters were going out to close to 1 million legal immigrants who were poor, old, or disabled, warning them that their food stamps and cash payments would be cut off in a few months unless they became citizens. Now, let's go to page 663 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The United States, instead, was consigning its people to the mercy of the free market, forgetting, or choosing to forget, the disastrous consequence of such a policy in the 20s. The market did not care about the environment or the arts, and it left many Americans without the basic means of subsistence, including adequate housing. Under Reagan, the government had reduced the number of housing units getting subsidies from 400,000 to 40,000. In the Clinton administration, the program ended altogether. Now, let's go to page 676 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The candidate with the most votes in Florida would get all the state's electors and win the presidency, but there was a raging dispute over whether Bush or Gore had received more votes in Florida. It seemed that many votes had not been counted, especially in districts where many black people lived, that ballots had been disqualified on technical grounds, that the marks made on the ballots by the voting machines were not clear. Bush had this advantage. His brother, Jeb Bush, was governor of Florida, and the Secretary of State in Florida, Katherine Harris, a Republican, had the power to certify who had more votes. And Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2 at CaseyWaters.com.